I'm Brent. Today we're going to talk about the traps and pitfalls of fitting a turbo to your Subaru when you probably may not know what to check. So my goal to help you in this video is to tell you what you need to be checking before you start the job yourself, so you can be aware of the important things to make sure you get the reliable outcome, because the car that we're going to give you an example of today unfortunately was repaired by a friend of a friend in the driveway of his house. And the turbo he bought secondhand, which probably originally was in reasonably good condition, turned into a bit of a hand grenade, and we have since worked out why. So I'm going to show you in this video. So let's start with what we're doing first. So could be any model Subaru, whether it's a EJ series 2.5 or 2 litre. Typically turbo sits here, air intake comes from the airbox through the intake pipe, under the inlet manifold, into the turbo, through the engine, out through the exhaust manifold, and up through the up pipe for all names and all purposes, and then through the turbine housing and out the exhaust. So hold that thought. We'll come back to that in a minute. So this is the turbo that was fitted as a second-hand part, a VF series STI, the IHI turbo. It's made by IHI, and it's a common upgrade for the 2.5 litre WRXs and Forester XTs, and comes on the later model STI model cars. So this is the compressor housing that connects to the intercooler, sort of down there, and the turbo intake pipe comes through here. So client rang us up about an unusual noise coming out of his turbo. We'd done some repair work several months ago. We encouraged him to carefully bring it into us, and you could hear the whizzing noise coming out of the turbo when you give it a bit of a rev and turn the engine off. Typically, it's a quick and easy way to tell if a turbo is faulty through bearing or other mechanical failure. If you give it a bit of a rev to spool it up, it won't generate boost, but it'll spool up the turbo, and then quickly turn the ignition off and listen carefully. And if you hear the bearings in or the turbo winding down, you know there's a pretty good chance it's faulty. And of course, we got a permission to remove the turbo, and if you have a look inside here, you'll see why. So you can see, looks like someone's tried to use the turbo as a bit of a meat grinder, and this part here supposed to sit in one place but flops around a bit. So of course, oh well, why did it fail, and why the grinding marks on the end? And of course our technician then went on a bit of a fact-finding mission back up through the air intake and into the airbox, and this is what we found in the airbox. Now that nut there is actually the nut probably off his original turbo that failed, which if you ever look at that nut there and look at the nut on the nose of this compressor housing, very, very similar in design. So whoever fitted this probably didn't realise that this had come off the old turbo and didn't go looking for the part. It was probably in the air intake, fitted a good quality second-hand turbo. As soon as he started up, the vacuum through the air intake's gone, suck that in. Of course, this won't go through the compressor housing, it just rattles around and makes a mess, instantly destroys the turbo. So what you can then also see, if you look at the back of the assembly, this is where the bearing has failed inside. This is all the oil that comes out of the back of the turbo, and you can see that's the bearing in the middle has now collapsed. Irrespective of the damage to the compressor housing, the bearing has failed, which has caused all the oil to come out through the bearing assembly into the back of the turbo exhaust housing, and all of that is what's left of the oil that was out of the engine, which is supposed to be. So first thing, always check to make sure you find the parts that are missing and have a really good look at the air intake. Secondly, we've spoken about this before, and we'll show you some of the things that unfortunately the person who did the repairs, get my microphone jammed. So this part here is the turbo intake pipe, which the turbo connects to, and you can see how that's split. So there's a hose clamp that goes around there, and this part here is designed to be soft to clamp onto the turbo, but this part here is stiffer design plastic to resist vacuum so it doesn't collapse. But due to age and kilometres on this design, these typically fail. If I get my cameraman to look right down back, you can see right down the bottom here, which is all where the get my camera in there, that's where the oil sits, because these lines here are breather lines, and a lot of oil sits in the bottom of this rubber assembly, and it perishes and damages it over time. So that's another thing that we're now going to have a fit, because the guy that fitted the turbo didn't replace it, because he should have, and this would have caused the engine to suck in unmetered air, because the air that goes into the turbo is measured by the airflow meter sensor that normally sits here. Now separately also, I just want to show you something. I'll get my cameraman to have a look around again. See this pipe here? So that pipe there is the drain that goes down, and I've left a cover off it because we normally put a rag over it. That's the drain that goes back down into the sump. So the oil comes into the turbo under pressure and then goes through the bearing and gravitates back down through that drain. So when you put the turbo back on, I'll show you in a minute, there's actually a fitting that goes on there that's designed to make sure it doesn't leak, because when the engine is operating under positive crankcase, if you don't fit this fitting properly with the right mechanical parts, it will actually leak and breathe out through here. But also you'll notice this line here, which has just been blanked off, but this is one of the water cooling lines that goes to the turbo as well. And of course, this is the up pipe to the turbo. And if you see right down inside there, that's where you can see, just I want to get that right. See down inside there, you can see that white matrix. That's actually a tiny little catalytic converter, which is a high restriction. There we go. Can we see it? Is it down in there, Jack? Or have we already fitted a...
Not this model.
Okay, so this model, that's right. So the earlier models had a catalytic converter in there. This one's got a catless up pipe. Some of the earlier model Foresters did have a catalytic converter in there, so that's something you need to look at if you're doing a turbo replacement. But of course, this part here is where the turbo sits on, that where the gaskets, we'll replace this gasket here with a new replacement gasket so it doesn't leak when it all goes back together. And then of course back down through there is where the exhaust connects on the back of the turbo. And we were talking before about the drain. So that part there is the drain. So the oil comes in under pressure through these fittings here. This is the water fitting because the core is also water cooled. Oil pressure goes in through there, drains out through the bottom. Now one thing you need to check, we'll do this before we put it all back together, is always check the oil supply to that fitting there, which is this part here. Because on the older model cars over a period of time, this line can gum up with soot and build up of old oily deposits and restrict the oil supply to the turbo. It is a metered connection. There is a very, very tiny orifice in here that restricts the amount of oil going into the turbo, which is in that banjo fitting there, which actually goes down into the top of the turbo. So it's very, very important if you replace these parts, you must check that carefully, because if you don't have enough, you can end up damaging the bearing in the turbo. But if you have too much, you end up with a little bit of oil bypass, which can then cause unusual smoky conditions going out through the exhaust. So very, very important to check oil supply to the turbo, because sometimes the bearing fails. Obviously in this situation we know what caused the failure first, but always good to check oil supply to the turbo before you put the turbo back on. Just carefully start the engine. Pretty horrible to start it in the condition it's in now, and just carefully measure the oil coming out of the supply line, which connects onto that into a little container. Measure it in a minute. It should be fairly healthy and a lot of oil going in there. If it's not, you may need to check the oil supply off the back of the high pressure oil gallery on the block that supplies those fittings to the turbo. So there you have it, how to diagnose and what to look for, and most of all what to avoid to make sure that you don't suffer the same mechanical damage, because of course now we're going to replace this with a brand new turbo with warranty, and then we'll do a custom tune, replace that turbo intake pipe. I'll show you that with another video, just so you know what we're talking about. And then the client will have a nice reliable car when it all goes back together. So of course you can follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter and Instagram. Remember, if you need a custom tune on this car, go to mrttune.com.au or send us an email so we can help you get a local tune done in Australia through our partner network anywhere in Australia. So no matter where you live in Australia, we've normally got a partner workshop that we can support you with our reliable custom tuning and technical parts as well. And you can then rely on the backup and knowledge of MRT through your local chosen workshop, through us guiding you and guiding the workshop. But for now, my name is Brett Middleton. I really hope this video has helped you. We'll see you again soon with our next installment on what to look for on your car. Bye for now.